My name is Isabella Hart, and for 5 years I gave every ounce of my energy to a company that never once saw my worth. I was the first one in the office each morning, the last one to leave at night, the one who fixed the mistakes no one else wanted to claim. I thought loyalty would protect me. I thought hard work would speak for itself. But one ordinary Tuesday morning, my world snapped in half. My boss didn't just end my job, he staged a spectacle. In front of the entire floor, he stripped me of my dignity, announcing my firing as if it were entertainment. I can still feel the cold fluorescent lights above me, the hush of shocked coworkers, the sting of humiliation burning down my spine. In that moment, every dream I'd built felt crushed under his smirk. Yet, what he couldn't see, what none of them could see, was the fire he just lit inside me. That public betrayal didn't break me, it hardened me. 2 weeks. That's all it took for the tables to turn. Because the man who laughed while I carried my belongings out of that office would soon be forced to shake my hand again, this time as his investor. Shattered that illusion. The subject line, mandatory meeting, immediate, glowed on my screen like a warning flare. My stomach tightened, but I told myself it was routine, maybe a quick update before the quarterly report. Still, the weight of those 3 words felt heavier than logic allowed. I rose from my chair and began the long walk across the open floor, the sound of my heels echoing like a gavel striking. Coworkers glanced up from their monitors, some offering tight smiles, others quickly looking away. Every step seemed to slow, as if the air itself thickened with something I couldn't yet name. When I reached the glass-walled office, my boss was already standing, a thin smile carved across his face. Instead of a private conversation, he gestured for me to stay in the center of the room. His voice carried across the entire floor, sharp and cold. "Isabella, you're done here," he announced, each word slicing through the murmur of keyboards and phone calls. No closed door, no mercy, just humiliation delivered under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights while dozens of colleagues watched, frozen between pity and relief that it wasn't them. My ears rang with the sudden silence that followed, my pulse a steady roar in its place. I felt every eye on me as I forced a small, steady nod, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. Gathering my belongings became a ritual of quiet defiance. The framed photo of my parents, a cracked coffee mug, a single worn notebook filled with late-night ideas. I placed each item into a cardboard box while whispers swirled like smoke around me. My hands trembled, but my back remained straight as I crossed the floor one final time, the exit door sliding open like a curtain falling on a cruel play. Outside, the city hummed as if nothing had changed, but inside, something darker was waking. A sharp, relentless flame born from humiliation and betrayal. I paused on the sidewalk, the cool air slicing across my face, and for a heartbeat, I let the pain settle. Then I felt it shift into something else, resolute. He thought he had ended my story, but he had only written the first line of my revenge. 2 weeks. That was all I needed to turn the humiliation of this morning into the power of a lifetime. 2 weeks. That became my battlefield. The day after my firing, I woke before dawn with the heart still pounding from the humiliation. But beneath the ache burned a new purpose. The first 24 hours were a blur of calls to former colleagues, late-night research, and endless cups of bitter coffee. I started with the numbers because numbers don't lie. Buried inside public filings and quiet whispers from ex-employees, I discovered something my former boss had carefully hidden. The company's finances were wobbling, its future hinging on a desperate hunt for investors. Every spreadsheet I opened felt like a weapon sharpening in my hands. I spent hours mapping the connections, suppliers, minor shareholders, and one particular venture fund that had once shown interest but backed away when terms turned sour. By the second day, I was moving on instinct. I rented a small co-working office with money pulled from my emergency savings and filled it with whiteboards scrawled in black marker, arrows linking names and numbers like a detective hunting a suspect. My phone never left my palm. I called in favors from friends in finance, former classmates in law school, even a cousin who worked in commercial real estate. Each conversation unlocked another door. I barely slept, living on takeout noodles and adrenaline, but exhaustion felt irrelevant compared to the surge of possibility. By the end of the first week, the plan had crystallized. If I could raise capital quickly, I could join a consortium of investors circling my old company. Instead of begging for a job, I would own a piece of the very ground they tried to bury me under. I crafted a pitch deck that told my story not as revenge, but as vision. Market gaps, expansion potential, hidden assets undervalued by arrogant management. I dressed each slide with hard data and quiet fury. The first investor meeting was held in a hotel lounge, all marble floors and soft jazz. As I walked in wearing the same blazer I'd worn the day of my firing, I felt the humiliation of that morning burn away, replaced by something electric. I spoke with calm precision, outlining the opportunity and the leverage my inside knowledge provided. One by one, the investors leaned forward with their eyes sharpening with interest. By the second meeting, commitments began to stack like dominoes. Every handshake, every signature brought me closer to the moment I could look my former boss in the eye as not an employee, but a stakeholder. The long nights, the cold coffee, the endless calculations, all of it condensed into a quiet, unstoppable momentum. 2 weeks ago, I was the girl carrying a cardboard box out of a silent office. Now, I was the woman positioning myself to walk back through those same doors with a contract powerful enough to turn humiliation into ownership. The clock was still ticking, but for the first time, it was ticking for me. The spark of revenge had already ignited, but during the third week, it roared into a full blaze, driving me beyond simple retaliation and into a strategic obsession. Each morning, I woke before sunrise, the city still half asleep, and filled my tiny rented office with the sound of rapid keystrokes and the smell of strong black coffee. I no longer felt like a former employee. I felt like a hunter closing in on prey. With the investors secured, the next step was to understand every weakness in the company's armor, because leverage was power and knowledge was leverage. I pored through market reports, studied their vendor contracts, and analyzed the quiet shift in client accounts that hinted at instability behind the polished public image. A contact from my university days, a soft-spoken analyst who owed me a favor, sent over internal memos suggesting that my old boss had overextended a key partnership, leaving him desperate for a cash infusion within the month. The discovery thrilled me. This wasn't just about buying into the company, it was about catching him exactly where it hurt. Late one night, while tracing supplier invoices, I stumbled across a pattern of inflated costs that suggested mismanagement or worse. My pulse quickened. It wasn't enough to own a piece of the business. I wanted a seat at the table where his mistakes would be judged. To strengthen my position, I reached out to a well-connected corporate lawyer, a woman known for dismantling boardroom egos with surgical precision. We met in a quiet rooftop bar, city lights flickering below, and over a single glass of wine she outlined the legal pathways to not only invest, but to secure voting rights that could shift control. Her confidence fueled my own, and by the time I left the rooftop, the cold night air tasted like victory waiting to be claimed. Yet beneath the adrenaline, a strange calm settled over me. This wasn't rage anymore. It was calculation. A quiet certainty that every humiliation I endured would soon become a weapon in my hand. The nights grew longer, but exhaustion felt like a distant memory as spreadsheets turned into blueprint and whispered tips transformed into actionable strategy. With each passing day, the distance between the woman fired in front of her peers and the woman preparing to stand as their potential owner widened until they felt like two different lives. I no longer dreamed of simply walking back into that office. I envisioned the moment when my former boss would be forced to recognize me not as a subordinate, but as the investor whose signature could decide his future. The countdown was no longer about days. It was about opportunities, each one bringing me closer to a confrontation he never saw coming. My humiliation had become my strategy, and my strategy was almost complete. Allies have a way of appearing when you're moving with purpose, and in the second week of my mission, I began to notice doors opening that I hadn't even knocked on. The first came unexpectedly. A discreet message from Marisol, a former senior manager who had quietly resigned months before my firing. She asked for a late-night coffee at a small cafe tucked beneath a bridge, a place where the hiss of steaming milk drowned out stray conversations. Marisol arrived with a folder in her hand and a look that told me she'd been waiting for this meeting as much as I had. Inside the folder were internal performance charts and a quiet bombshell. Proof that the company's new product launch, loudly celebrated in press releases, was already hemorrhaging money. "He's bluffing investors," she whispered, eyes scanning the empty tables around us. The weight of her trust settled over me like armor. That single sheet of paper became a key to the kingdom, evidence of instability that would make my investment pitch impossible to ignore. Soon after, another ally emerged in the form of Jonah, a junior accountant still working inside the company. His voice shook when he called me from a blocked number, but his loyalty to fairness outweighed his fear. Through encrypted messages, he slipped me fragments of financial data, each confirming the quiet rot beneath the glossy quarterly reports. Their courage strengthened my own resolve, reminding me that this wasn't just personal revenge. It was a reckoning for everyone who had been silenced. Nights blurred into early mornings as we shared encrypted files and whispered strategies, each revelation tightening the net around my former boss. I felt like a conductor guiding an invisible orchestra, every ally adding their note to the growing crescendo. My lawyer moved in parallel, drafting clauses and negotiating terms with the investors that gave me more leverage than I had dreamed possible. Minority ownership with major influence. With every new document, every midnight call, my plan evolved from a risky gamble to an airtight campaign. And yet, amid the thrill of progress, there were moments of quiet reflection. I would stand by the window of my small office and watch the city lights flicker, realizing that these people were risking careers, maybe even livelihoods, because they believed in the justice of what we were building. The Isabella who once stayed late to impress a dismissive boss was gone. In her place stood a strategist surrounded by allies who trusted her to lead. By the end of the second week, our coalition was complete. Investors ready, legal pathways cleared, and insider knowledge sharp enough to cut through any boardroom defense. The humiliation that had once echoed like a wound now pulsed like a battle drum, each beat carrying us toward the day when the man who had mocked me would have no choice but to face the network of quiet rebels standing behind my signature. The stage was nearly set, and the next move would be the one that changed everything. The final week became a blur of signatures, late-night strategy calls, and the quiet thrill of watching a plan harden into reality. With allies secured and investors committed, I shifted into full execution mode, transforming my tiny rented office into a war room of glowing laptop screens and walls crowded with contracts and timelines. Every morning began with a ritual: black coffee, a deep breath, and a silent reminder that every humiliating second of my firing was fuel for the day ahead. My lawyer refined the purchase agreements with surgical precision, each clause engineered to secure not just a financial stake, but voting rights that would give me influence well beyond my percentage of ownership. Investors peppered me with last-minute questions, but my answers, backed by insider data and relentless preparation, left no cracks to exploit. We scheduled conference calls across time zones, negotiating valuation points while I paced the narrow floor, my heart hammering like a clock counting down to the inevitable reveal. Late one night, as rain streaked the office windows, I stared at the final contract displayed on my screen, the document that would make me not merely an investor, but a decision maker in the very company that had discarded me. My hands hovered over the trackpad, remembering the day I carried a cardboard box past the same man whose fate now hinged on the stroke of my signature. I signed without hesitation, the soft click of the digital pen echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. The investors followed, their e-signatures appearing one by one until the agreement was sealed and a new ownership block quietly formed beneath my former boss's nose. Outside, the city glowed under a sheen of rain, neon lights blurring into rivers of color. And for the first time since my firing, I allowed myself a slow, victorious smile. But there was still one final step before the confrontation I had envisioned since that humiliating morning. The official investor introduction meeting scheduled for the end of the week. My name would appear on the roster alongside venture capital giants and private equity firms, a silent predator among familiar sharks. I spent the remaining days rehearsing every detail, the tilt of my voice when I spoke, the steadiness of my gaze, the simple but deliberate outfit that would remind him of the employee he thought he had erased. By Thursday night, as I zipped my portfolio and slid the final contract inside, a strange calm settled over me. Revenge was no longer a fantasy whispered into late-night darkness. It was a legal reality backed by signatures, capital, and quiet allies ready to step into the light. Tomorrow, I would walk back into the company I once served, not as the woman he humiliated, but as the investor who now held the power to shape his future. The game was no longer about survival, it was about ownership, and my moment of reckoning was only hours away. The morning of the investor meeting arrived like the calm before a storm. Gray skies stretched across the city, the air thick with the scent of rain and anticipation. I dressed deliberately, choosing a tailored black suit that whispered authority without screaming revenge, the same shade I had worn the day I was fired. The elevator ride to the conference floor felt surreal, every chime pulling me closer to the moment I had replayed in my mind for 2 relentless weeks. When the doors opened, the company's lobby spread before me, unchanged yet utterly different in my eyes. The same receptionist glanced up, her polite greeting faltering as recognition flickered across her face. I offered a small, measured smile and continued toward the glass-walled boardroom where the meeting was set to begin. Inside, the air buzzed with low conversation as investors gathered, venture capitalists in crisp suits, private equity partners tapping on tablets, and at the head of the table, the man who once dismissed me with a smirk. My former boss. His posture radiated the same self-satisfied arrogance I remembered, but there was a tightness around his eyes that betrayed unease. I took my seat 2 chairs away, placing my leather portfolio neatly before me. When the introductions began, my name rolled across the room like a carefully aimed bullet. His head snapped toward me, confusion flickering into shock, as the moderator continued without pause. Isabella Art, lead investor representing the new consortium. I held his gaze, steady and unflinching, as the realization settled into the silence between us. He forced a thin smile, but his knuckles whitened around the edge of his notepad. While the financial projections and partnership terms filled the next hour, I spoke with calm precision, presenting questions that cut to the heart of the company's vulnerabilities, questions only someone with intimate knowledge could ask. Each word tightened the invisible noose around his carefully crafted narrative. Investors nodded thoughtfully, their attention shifting from him to me as the authority in the room began to tilt. At one point, he tried to interrupt, his voice a strained attempt at control, but I countered with hard data and the quiet confidence of someone who knew every corner of the battlefield. The meeting closed with polite applause and a formal signing of documents, each pen stroke sealing my place as a key stakeholder. As we stood, his eyes met mine again, but this time there was no arrogance, only the dawning comprehension of a man who had underestimated the very person now holding a share of his future. I offered my hand, a faint smile curving at the edges. "Looks like we'll be working together again," I said softly, the words carrying the weight of every late night, every whispered plan, every sting of public humiliation. His grip was cold, his silence louder than any apology could have been. As I turned to leave, the thunder outside finally broke, a sharp crack echoing through the glass walls, a perfect punctuation to the victory I had just claimed. The days that followed the investor meeting unfolded like the quiet after a storm. No explosions, no grand confrontation, just the slow, undeniable shift of power settling into place. My phone buzzed with updates from lawyers and investors, confirming the final paperwork. Each message a reminder that I no longer stood outside the walls of the company. I now owned a seat at its table. The transformation felt almost unreal. Only 2 weeks earlier, I had carried a cardboard box through those same halls, my dignity scattered in whispers. Now I returned not as an employee begging for recognition, but as a shareholder whose vote could steer decisions and alter futures. The first official board session arrived on a crisp morning scented with rain-washed asphalt. I entered the conference room to find familiar faces, some startled, some quietly pleased, as they realized I was no longer a ghost of the past, but a key figure in the company's future. My former boss sat at the far end, shoulders squared, but eyes betraying the fatigue of someone who finally understood that control had slipped from his grasp. When the meeting began, I spoke sparingly, choosing my words with the precision of a scalpel. I asked about the underperforming product line, referencing data points only an insider would know. I proposed a restructuring plan that, on paper, was about efficiency, but in practice, placed decision-making power firmly in the hands of the new investor bloc. Each suggestion landed with the quiet authority of someone who no longer needed approval. He responded with forced professionalism, his voice tight around the edges, but the room no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the numbers, the signatures, and to me. As the agenda wound down, I caught him watching me across the polished table, a flicker of recognition passing through his guarded expression, recognition of the woman he had once dismissed, now the architect of his company's future. When the meeting adjourned, I lingered by the window, the city skyline stretching beyond the glass in a wash of morning light. He approached cautiously, perhaps searching for words that would lessen the weight of our shared history, but I offered only a polite nod. There was no need for gloating or revenge-laced speeches. The silence between us said everything. My victory was not in his humiliation, but in the undeniable fact that I had risen beyond the limits he tried to impose. As I left the building for the final time that day, the air felt different, cleaner, sharper, full of promise. The same streets where I had once walked in shame now carried the sound of quiet triumph beneath my footsteps. I had come back not to destroy, but to own, to prove that no one's cruelty could define my worth. In the end, power didn't roar. It whispered through signed contracts, steady voices, and the unshakable certainty that I had turned my greatest humiliation into my greatest leverage. My name, Isabella Hart, was now etched into the foundation of the company that once tried to erase me, and that was all the revenge I would ever need.